An equestrian statue is a statue of a rider mounted on a horse. Due to most people in the early days of Rome being illiterate, those in power needed to communicate their political persona through visuals, such as equestrian statues. During the beginning years of Christianity, many of these ancient Roman statues were melted down for their bronze pieces. The statue of Marcus Aurelius was one of the few statues from antiquity that survived, mainly due to the misconception that this statue was of the first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great. The equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius was built around 170 AD. However, the original placement of the statue is unknown. It once stood near St. John Lateran up until it was relocated to the Capitolio in Rome by Michelangelo in 1538 to add to his redesign of the hill. It stood as the centerpiece of Capitolio until it was found to be deteriorating from pollution. As a result, the statue was replaced by a replica in 1971. The original was moved inside the Capitoline Museum to be preserved properly, where it still stands today. There is no written evidence of how the statue intended to represent Marcus Aurelius, so the interpretations rely solely on the statue itself. At first glance, it can be seen that Marcus Aurelius is much bigger than his horse. This was done to emphasize a certain dominance he held over the horse. The emperor's facial expression and pose is calm and stable, unlike his horse, who is wide-eyed and full of energy. It successfully conveys the emperor as a dominant figure controlling chaos. He does so with only one hand, demonstrating skill, which could be a reflection upon his reign. As for physical features, the emperor wears a perfect Greek beard worn by philosophers. His beard is perfectly distributed onto his cheeks and worn long, adding to his wise character. He is clothed in civic garb, including a short-sleeved tunic gathered at the waist by a knotted belt. Over the tunic, a cloak is draped down his right shoulder. As for footwear, he wears senatorial boots, typically worn by the patrician class. The position of his head is turned slightly right, in the direction of his outstretched arm. His right arm is stretched outward, palm down, a well-known pose typically indicating that the emperor was about to give a speech, or it could be the popular political tactic offered by emperors as a way to pardon their enemies. We see that his ceremonial dress and physical features emphasize his role as a Stoic philosopher, rather than his role as a war leader. Although the emperor did not like the idea of war, he saw it as a necessity for a prosperous state. In this statue, he chose to be remembered for his thoughtful nature. He is shown as one restoring peace and controlling chaos, rather than one of post-war celebration of military victory.
We are currently standing in the middle of Piazza Signoria, located in Florence, Italy, where the equestrian statue of Cosimo de' Medici is located. Cosimo de' Medici, born in 1519, was a member of the Medici dynasty that ruled through much of the Italian Renaissance. He was the Duke of Florence and Tuscany, head of the Florentine Republic. He died in 1574, and Cosimo's statue was commissioned after his death by his son, Ferdinando de' Medici, who also had his own equestrian monument. Cosimo, before he took power, was a banker and politician, and although he was favored by many who had a great influence, Cosimo himself had little influence and was relatively unknown in Florence. Cosimo's rise to power was somewhat unexpected, which drove Cosimo to establish his leadership prowess, evident in this statue. The bronze equestrian statue of Cosimo de' Medici was erected in 1594 in Piazza Signoria by Giambologna, a well-known sculptor of his time who had significant influence throughout Italian art during the Renaissance period. Giambologna is most known for the Rape of the Sabine woman statue, erected from marble in 1581 to 83, of which is presently located near the equestrian statue of Cosimo. The statue features Cosimo on a horse, following classical Roman tradition of equestrian statues as a monument to the ruler's power. The base of the statue depicts key scenes from Cosimo's life as the leader of the Florentine Republic. Two of the most important scenes are the coronation of Cosimo in Rome as the Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1570, and his entrance into Siena after his victory. Here is the first scene of the coronation of Cosimo in Rome as Grand Duke. And here we can see his entrance into Siena. It should be noted that Cosimo is in full armor and holding a military baton. This pushes the idea that he was authoritative in his role and was a powerful leader who was successful in his military campaigns. The choice to include Cosimo sporting a beard may be a direct reference from the statue of Marcus Aurelius in his effort to establish that he was an intelligent philosopher. Furthermore, there is an image of Heracles slaying the centaur on his shoulder plate of his armor. All these characteristics, combined with the horse's leg raised, makes it seem as if it was trotting and as if Cosimo was on triumph marching through the city. This adds to the effect that Cosimo was a strong, determined ruler who led the Florentine Republic to victory. The statue is positioned near the Fountain of Neptune by Ammanati, of which was commissioned by Cosimo himself. Unfortunately, the fountain is under renovation, so we can't get a good view of it. The statue was part of Cosimo's effort to display his land and sea ambitions. Much of the square is dedicated to Cosimo's glory. Even the Neptune figure is said to have a face that is meant to resemble that of Cosimo, emphasizing his control over Florence and the Mediterranean. The fountain and statue taken together represent naval and land prowess for a propagandist manner, with the statue being the main focus, thus putting Cosimo at the center of the surrounding glory.
The Marcus Aurelius and Cosimo I de' Medici's equestrian statues are used to display prowess and authority with respect to what each leader wanted to highlight in their reign. Aurelius was alive during the erection of his statue and heavily influenced the result. Medici's statue came posthumously, commissioned by his son, giving young Medici full say of how to depict his father. Nonetheless, each leader is presented through characterizations they have created for themselves through propaganda. In modern context, Ulysses S. Grant has an equestrian statue erected in his honor that closely follows the stylistic elements of his predecessors. Equestrian statues can be used to demonstrate power through size. Aurelius straddles a stallion that is not much larger than himself. Although subtle, Aurelius's equestrian sculpture emphasizes his superiority. Inspired by the Aurelius statue, the same tactic is mirrored in Medici's sculpture as he is unrealistically balanced to the proportions of the horse. This similarity makes it necessary for viewers to look up to the leaders and disregard their true height, because anyone on a horse will appear significant. The subjects flaunt contrasting fashions, purposeful to highlight their modesty and status. Without armor, horse tack, and stirrups, Aurelius is strangely seated on a riled-up pony that flaunts a war chamfron, but fails to illustrate himself as a post-war victor. In contrast to his victory column in Rome that depicts violent war scenes with Aurelius as the foreman, he aims to direct onlookers toward his philosophical Stoic persona. In plain clothes and a rugged beard, Aurelius detaches himself from being a combative man. Upon first look at the statue with no previous knowledge of the emperor, one can assume that he was not one to involve himself with war. Medici's son wanted to glorify his father's reign and importance to the Florentine Republic. Medici in full uniform gazes off into the distance while his stallion also raises a hoof in the air. As Grand Duke, Medici is being portrayed as an adept military general. Intended to emphasize his success and accomplishments, the Medici statue is both for admiration and characterizing the Grand Duke as a military hero comparable to people in the past much greater than he was, such as an emperor, maybe like Marcus Aurelius. Both statues recreate the images of Aurelius and Medici by stripping the emperor of pejorative traits and boosting the Grand Duke's profile. Referring back to Medici's stare into oblivion, Aurelius has a more direct look with an outstretched hand indicating that he is addressing someone. Medici may have been sculpted this way to illustrate him basking in his excellence as his statue stands on a base that is covered with important accomplishments from his lifetime. His head is held high in a triumphant manner. Because of his loyalty to Florence, Medici's son wanted to ensure his father was seen as a successful duke, and his equestrian statue fulfills that wish. Aurelius exhibits a soft and calm face, which can be interpreted as him being a responsible leader that hardly ever considers violence in his decision-making. The emperor's gesture is another element of Aurelius, painting himself to be a more humane general that thinks over his actions before bringing them to fruition. Aurelius and Medici's son exploit art's power and use it to their advantage by erasing the ideas of themselves they do not want to be remembered for, and adjust the reality of the statue to render a new truth or perspective of themselves. In years to come, even Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War commander who led the Union Army to victory, will have an equestrian statue erected posthumously to honor his achievements. Contest-winning sculptor and architect duo Schrady and Casey would go on to design and build the final masterpiece we see today. Without a doubt, you recognize the mounted figure as being someone of great importance and deserving the utmost respect. This equestrian statue has the power to convey the writer's significance at first glance, mirroring a theme seen in Marcus Aurelius and Cosimo I de' Medici. Positioned in front of the U.S. Capitol at one end of the National Mall, facing Abraham Lincoln, the statue already has symbolic meaning in its location by linking the two who fought to save the Union. Much like Medici's statue, Schrader and Casey utilized the environment to their advantage. The surrounding buildings and previous monuments work harmoniously with the new addition, adding to the central theme of freedom. Much like his predecessors, Grant had two claims to fame. Being a successful Union commander and later serving 2 terms as president provides Grant with qualities that those who served under him would later want to recognize on his behalf. Despite being a figure associated with war, he is depicted with a relaxed posture, plain clothing, and without a sword. This is a direct correlation to the statue of Emperor Aurelius. Both men were leaders of war, but were mounted on their horses as seldom people. Grant is one part of an interactive tripartite installation which has 2 scenes of war flanking his sides. He sits as a symbol of tranquility amongst the horror and chaos that the Civil War brought, alluding to his victories at Shiloh, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and Appomattox, where General Robert E. Lee would surrender and essentially end the war. Grant and Medici's statues were put up in honor of them by other people who wanted to emphasize the importance of their efforts and achievements. This is significant because it illustrates the content of their character more truthfully, as opposed to Marcus Aurelius, who wanted to paint himself more as a stoic philosopher than a man of combat. Grant's horse, Cincinnatus, mimics the charisma of his rider by having all 4 hooves planted to the ground. This is different from Aurelius and Medici, who have fired-up ponies, lifting 1 hoof into the air. Although equestrian statues radiate a sense of superiority, this contrast is consistent in maintaining Grant's resolute leadership, because the horse is not in an off-putting stance that would cause the viewer to be afraid. In addition to this, the panels along the sides of Grant simply depict low reliefs of soldiers marching, whereas Medici's son had his father's own accomplishments on the plaques to display for everyone in the piazza. Art has the ability to reimagine its subjects. With the wealth and power of Marcus Aurelius and the Cosimo I Medici dynasty, each high-profile figure utilized the opportunity to manipulate their identities through equestrian statues. During their reign, visual propaganda was a surefire method of communicating ideas between the different groups of people. Today, the statues preserve the personas each leader made for themselves, and only through context and historical knowledge can a viewer understand the sculpture's purpose in their entireties. The noteworthy takeaway from Grant's statue is that it was campaigned for by many different people. It underwent major discussion to see how to properly illustrate the Union commander without straying far from the historical context. More thought is put into the monuments that we erect today and in the future to avoid misleading information and political or military propaganda.